We've been sort of going through the last few weeks the letters to the seven congregations there in Asia. So far, we visited the first four: um, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira last week. Uh, the message to the Ephesians, those in Ephesus: return to your first love. And we went over to Sardis, and the message to Sardis, nothing critical, by the way, but stay faithful and you'll receive the crown of life. Pergamum, a very fantastic archaeological site, but they were told to hold fast to the name of Jesus. They were undergoing persecution. And last week we were in Thyatira. Thyatira were very active in doing good. They were growing, but there was still a problem. They were tolerating a woman referred to as Jezebel, who claimed to receive and teach messages from God, but in reality, she was leading Christians away from God. Jesus said that he would deal with her. But the nice thing was, not everybody was following her. Jesus put no extra burden on the rest, but to hang on and to overcome. Our lesson tonight, we're going to travel on down the road a bit to the next of our cities, and we're going to be in Sardis this evening. The fifth of the letters, the first letter that's in our chapter 3 of the book of Revelation. Now, I like to put little subtitles on these. My subtitle is Alive but Dead. Ramsey just called it the city of death. So that's where we're going to be. As always, we're going to look at mainly the same things we look at each week on the letters themselves. We're going to have a look at the history of Sardis, and I did find it to be an absolutely fascinating history. We're going to go through a tour of the archaeological site, at least what we were able to see, and we're going to then look at the message that Jesus had for them. As on our tour last November, still don't have the thing set right, but I need to straighten that one out. But we landed in Istanbul, traveled into what would have been Roman Asia. Our order of visiting the seven cities was Pergamum and then Smyrna. And it's from there we went to Sardis. It doesn't look like very far in a big map of Turkey, but it was a wee drive anyway. Sardis was one of the great cities of ancient history. According to the Greeks, it was the greatest of all cities. It was once the capital of Lydia, which had been a powerful empire. You can see how much this map shows that how much territory Lydia controlled there in Western Turkey in Asia. Ramsey writes this about it. Says its situation marks it out as a ruling city according to the methods of early warfare and early kings. It was, however, more like a robber's stronghold than an abode of civilized men. And in a peaceful and civilized age, its position was found inconvenient. In the Roman period, it was almost like a city of the past, a relic of the period of barbaric warfare, which lived rather on its ancient prestige than on its suitability to present conditions. And that's a theme we're going to see that runs through this letter. Sardis had been wealthy. It was the home of King Croesus, who is said to have been the richest king in history. He was the model for King Midas, the king with the golden touch. Sardis was located about 30 miles southeast of Thyatira. It was built near Mount Tmolus, the ridge that bounded it on the south. It was built on a hill 1,500 feet above the plain below. This is a photo from around 1900 from William Ramsey's book, and you see that little peak there on the hill? That is where Sardis was. 3 sides were surrounded by precipitous cliffs with only one path up it, which was easily defended. it was never successfully stormed. Uh, Part of the city ended up spreading out into the below the hill onto the plains itself. But because of the smallness of the plateau on top, uh, it could never have been a large city on the site where it was, which wasn't a problem as early cities were small. But even 100 to 125 years ago, in the days of William Ramsay, he said access to the site was a tedious and difficult climb. For those who've been there, this is not the precise part of the site we visited. The collection of photos of our pictorial library of Bible lands have no photos of the top. It actually has a photo from the top, but nothing of the top. I get the impression there's not much up there, and I'll talk about that later. But it seems to originally, by the way, not have been called Sardis, but something like Hyde. Homer uses that name for it. Here's a photo of it, not one of ours, but from the pictorial library of biblical lands, and you can see the hill, the Acropolis there, that it was built on. We're not sure when the city was founded. We know it's ancient. The earliest known occupation of this site is around 1400 BC. Ramsay put the settlement of the area as being around 1200 BC, at the time of the beginnings of the Lydian kingdom. It was a capital and royal city from its beginning. It presided over the entire valley, the Hermus Valley. As the city grew, the lofty plateau it was on was too small, so a lower city was built on the west and north sides of the original city. The old city was still used an Acropolis. Herodotus, in his writings, refers to it as an Acropolis. It basically became a double city, and it was called Sardeis, which is Sardis, but the difference in it is it's a plural word indicating the two parts of the city. And it was a wealthy city. There was an abundance of fertile land around it, forests with a good water supply. The river uh, Pactolus ran through the edge of the city, which was a source of gold in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, which made it into Greek legend. By the time of the Romans, no gold was there, nor is there any today. But according to Pliny as well, this was the place where the dyeing of wool was discovered. It was on a natural trade route. And all of those things combined to make Sardis and its inhabitants the wealthiest and most powerful people in Anatolia. That's Western Turkey. As a capital of a great kingdom, war marked its history. If a country was at war with the kingdom of Lydia, they had to fight against Sardis. One by one, their armies fell due to the power of Sardis. I hope I'm conveying that it was a very powerful city pre-Roman times. William Ramsay says about it, it was the great, the wealthy, the impregnable city, which none could strive and prevail. In the immemorial contest between Asia and Europe, it represented Asia, and the Greek colonies of the coastlands stood for Europe. Sardis was the one great enemy of the Ionian cities. It learned from them, taught them, and conquered them all in succession. That is Sardis. Their coins, and this is an example of one of them, contain the proud title, Sardis, at least the way it'd be translated, Sardis, the first metropolis of Asia and of Lydia and of Hellenism. And they felt justified in using this title. They were a powerful kingdom. But despite that, and despite the fact that it had never been conquered, it did finally fall. Again, Ramsay writes, the destruction of the powerful kingdom, and the capture of the impregnable city by a hitherto hardly known and utterly despised enemy was announced to the Greek cities soon after the middle of the 6th century BC. The news came almost without preparation and was all the more impressive on that account. It was conquered by King Cyrus, Cyrus the Great of Persia, around 547 BC. Croesus, who was the king of Lydia at the time, consulted the Delphic Apollo before entering the war with Cyrus, and he had been told by the oracle that he would be victorious. Ramsay writes, he then asked about the war against Cyrus, which he had in mind, and he heard with delight that if he crossed the Halys, he would destroy a mighty empire. That's a river, by the way. He crossed the Halys and received a crushing defeat. The city of Sardis was then taken by stealth. And again, this is a photo from our collection, and you can see how difficult it would be to get to the top. There was a way in, but it was well fortified, so you couldn't really attack from that angle. But apparently there is a hidden path going up to the Sardis Acropolis. The Persians saw a soldier, it said, coming down the path to retrieve a helmet he dropped. So the Persian army figured out that's a way up, and that night they walked single file up that narrow path and had control of the city by morning. There was no guard posted on that side because they thought it was impossible to enter the city that way. At least that's the story. Ramsay suggests that story is more folklore, and that the reality was probably that the Persians studied the fortress, discovered a weakness in the wall where they could climb the rock at night to be unobserved and enter the Acropolis because it was unguarded on that side. A road which connected it to Susa was then built by Darius I. By the way, history repeated itself about 340 years later when Antiochus the Great captured the city by the same method in 214 BC. By this time, Sardis had become increasingly Hellenized after the conquests of Alexander the Great. During this time, temples were built as well as a theater on top of the Acropolis. Worship, that leads us nicely into worship. Sardis was the seat of the worship of Cybele, Cybele. In fact, it's referred to as the licentious worship of Cybele. And the ruins of the temple are still there. That's a photo from Ramsay's book about 1900 that was taken. Cybele was the patron deity of the city and seems to have been a nature-based goddess, nature-based worship. The Greeks, though, equated her with the maiden Proserpine. They had an alliance coin which marked a religious agreement with Ephesus, and it showed Artemis, representing Ephesus, goddess of Ephesus, with her stags, and beside it was a veiled image of Cybele. By the way, coins also showed lions, which was one of the favorite animals of Cybele. Although healing power was often attributed to their gods and goddesses, in Sardis this was even magnified because they thought that Cybele had the power of restoring life to the dead. There's also a temple to Artemis that was built on basically that same site. Gene West, in his commentary, suggested that possibly Artemis and Cybele were the same goddess, as the temple is right there together. And he very well could be right. Zeus was also worshipped as Zeus Lydios, and is often found on the coins of Sardis. The city was destroyed by an earthquake in AD 17. By this time, they're under Roman rule. And Tiberius, who's pictured there on the right of this photo, rebuilt it. He gave a donation of 10 million sesterces and remitted all taxation for 5 years so they could concentrate on rebuilding Sardis. Now, I don't know what the current value of 10 million sesterces is, but Ramsay said that 125 years ago, in his day, that it was worth 400,000 pounds. Well, if it's worth that in his day, it's got to be 10 or 100 times more than that today. It would have been a vast fortune. So, because he did this, they built a temple to honor him and his mother, Livia. That's Livia seated on his right, on our left, as we're looking at the photo. So, we find emperor worship there as well. Sardis was a great governmental city before Rome took over. But once it was part of Rome, they lost their political importance. Again, Ramsay writes, it is plain that the greatness of Sardis under the Roman rule was rooted in past history, not in present conditions. The Acropolis ceased during that period to be the true city. It was inconvenient and useless, and it was doubtless regarded as a historical and archaeological monument rather than a really important part of the living city. As a Greco-Roman metropolis in the 1st to 4th centuries, civic amenities like public baths and a stadium were added. The name given to the city by Ramsay, as I mentioned earlier, was the city of death, a city of softness and luxury, of apathy and immorality. It has a very well preserved gymnasium, which we'll have a look at in just a few minutes. But a chap named Charles, quoted in Robertson's Word Pictures, says it's a contrast of past splendor and present unresting decline. They had been a great city, but by the 1st century, that was past, and they were in decline. Ramsay writes, thus, when the 7 letters were written, Sardis was a city of the past, which had no future before it. Its greatness was connected with a barbarous and half-organized state of society and could not survive permanently in a more civilized age. Sardis must inevitably decay. Today, it's near the Turkish town of Silikli, and the site is called Sart, S-A-R-T. Obadiah, by the way, seems to mention Sardis by the name of Sepharad in his prophecy. The Persians moved some of the Jewish exiles here to this area as well. The Persians called this town, I don't know how to pronounce this, C-P-A-R-D-A, Saparda, or something like that. And it was the western capital of the Persian Empire. There was a Jewish population. By the 4th century A.D., they had a very luxuriant synagogue. We don't know when the good news of Jesus arrived here. Possibly, and maybe even probably, during the time that Paul was in Ephesus. As that verse we referenced earlier said that while he was there, the good news spread out throughout all of Roman Asia. So that's possibly when it got it. Let's have a quick look at the site itself. This is a map. It's on a sign that I took a photo of, but it helps show a little bit of what the site is like from a map perspective. Of note, down here we have the Temple of Artemis. The Acropolis is up in this area here, and within the Acropolis was a Greek theater and also a Roman stadium. There was also a Roman temple up on the top of the Acropolis as well. The part that we visited was this. It was the Roman bath and gymnasium, the Jewish synagogue, and some Byzantine shops. So that's largely what I'm going to show you photos of. This is a view of the Acropolis that I took just after we arrived on site. You can see the top of the hill there, 1,500 feet high. We didn't ascend. And apparently the top, from what I read, is a crumbling rock and little remains of what once stood there. As we entered into the site, there were the Byzantine shops with you see the Roman bathhouse there in the background with the peaked roof. This shop, apparently, they said, and I guess they found the archaeology to say this, was a paint shop. But within it were found two crosses, two carved crosses, which I found being of interest. It suggested that the shop owner was a Christian, that he used these on the front of his water tank. You had Roman columns that would have been on the Roman Avenue, and we walked down to that to get to the Jewish synagogue. This synagogue dates from the 4th to 6th centuries AD, so several hundred years after this letter was written. But during the excavations, there's also found evidence of Jewish life in Jewish homes and Jewish shops. So we do know from that, there was a Jewish population here. Although it's after our time period, it's still of interest to have a look at it. This synagogue had mosaic tiled floors, which are still being restored. And you can see in this photograph here just how beautiful the floors were. This is an artist's impression of what the forecourt of the synagogue would have looked like back in its heyday. And this is a photograph of what there is there today. So you can see it's very similar, but of course we don't have the big building with the roof and all of that, but we do have the entrances that you saw there. When you go into the synagogue, this is from the inside looking back towards the doors of forecourt. Two alcoves there. On the right, it would have been the place they housed the Torah. And the one on the left, apparently from what we were told, was where circumcisions would have been performed. But notice as well the mosaic floor that's there in the foreground. Here's another view of a different mosaic floor. This one's sort of black and white, almost like waves in the sea, is it not? And there's this one, which again, lots of color, lots of intricate design there. And then there's this one, again, very intricately designed mosaic floors. Now, they were actually reconstructing sections of the floor while we were there. We had to walk around them, but you can see how they're mimicking the original designs and taking the proper stones and putting them back into place. So there's this is sort of near the area where they were working. Again, very, very colorful. That would have been amazing in its heyday, and even today, it's very beautiful. But next door was the Roman bathhouse. The gymnasium would have been on the level ground in the front. Now, keep in mind how the Romans did athletics. Men only and no clothing. I'm sure that caused problems with the synagogue next door. But this building dates to the 2nd century AD, so it would have been there when the synagogue was built. This is the back part of the gymnasium area. You can see some pillars and some other bits of archaeology there. But the bathhouse itself, very, very beautiful building and very intricate. The columns and the bits there at the top have been carved. It's just a beautiful, beautiful building. As you go into the entrance of it, again, you can see how fascinating it really, really was. There's another view of that. All the columns and the various bits they had there as well. But if you go inside the building, you end up at the Roman baths. This was the Roman pool. This would have been the frigidarium, the cold water pool. And so that was back in there. But then you walk out to the left of our picture there to go out the back, and there's nothing. So there would have been, I'm sure, more parts of the baths in the back as well. Of course, being Romans, they had latrines as well. So that's a Roman latrine. You can see the places where the men would have sat. They also had some sarcophagi on display. They have found the Lydian royal graves near here, and I'm assuming that may be what some of these are. But of course, throughout, there's more archaeology just laying on the ground, the pillars and the bits of buildings and sarcophagi there as well. Is an aerial view of what we visited. Obviously, I did not take this, showing the synagogue on the left. It didn't have the roof over it when this was taken. This is from about 20 years ago, and not as much had been excavated on the synagogue. But you can see the bathhouse, and you can see the gymnasium and the columns that were standing there as well. So you can see how all that would have been situated together in Sardis. Down the road is the temple to Artemis, which our group as a whole did not go see. I think a few people may have journeyed out there. But notice again those two columns standing in the right-hand side of the picture, which we saw earlier, that was identified as a temple to Cybele. But this is a temple to Artemis there as well. And again, you can see the Apocrypha in the background of this photo. When you see them so high up, you can see why they thought they were impregnable, that there's no way anybody would ever get up there, but they happened twice. Anyway, let's get into the text of the letter. Write to the messenger of the congregation in Sardis. He who has God's 7 spirits and 7 stars says these things. Ramsey writes, the analogy between the Ephesian and Sardian letters is close, and the two have to be studied together. History had moved on similar lines with the two churches. Both had begun enthusiastically and cooled down. Degeneration was the fact in both. But in Ephesus, the degeneration had not yet become so serious as in Sardis. Hence, in the Ephesian letters, the keynote is merely change, instability, and uncertainty. In the Sardian letter, the keynote is degradation, false pretension, and death. So Jesus identifies himself in this letter as he who has God's 7 spirits and the 7 stars. Again, a reference back to that description of Jesus by John in chapter 1. By the way, the identification, the letter to Ephesus, was similar. The one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one walking in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. So we've got some of the same imagery between both of these letters. 7 spirits, a reference to the Holy Spirit, that which we must have to be spiritually alive. And Jesus is still holding the 7 stars in his right hand. That tells us there was still hope. Despite their feebleness, he had not let them go. Jesus still held them. Of course, only Jesus could give them life. But from there, he launches straight into his message. I know your works, and that you have a name that you live, but you are dead. Be watchful and strengthen the things which are about to die, for I've not found your works completed before my God. Stephen Travis writes, in the earlier letters, Christ has given the good news before bringing the bad news, to which the church must face up. But the church at Sardis gets no such gentle buildup. Christ has no more severe message than this one. He jumps right in. It's almost like Paul writing to the Galatians, jumps right in, dealing with what's wrong there. This is the way the NIV translates it. He's aware of them, what they were doing, what they were not doing. They go straight into their need to change. And he says, this is the NIV, you need to wake up. Wake up. When people heard about Sardis, they thought of a group of Christians that looked really alive. In reality, Jesus said they were dead. They may have passed the scrutiny of those around them, even of Christians around them, but they weren't fooling God. Undoubtedly, they were doing right things, they were teaching right things, but they just weren't alive. They weren't alive for God. Stephen Travis again writes, like the city in which it's set, the church has a reputation from the past, but there's no corresponding reality in the present. And no one has noticed. The church itself has not noticed because it's asleep. That's why it's urged to wake up. If you think about it, this congregation was very much like the fig tree that Jesus cursed. Remember back in Matthew chapter 21, Jesus saw a fig tree beside the road and going to it found nothing but leaves. He said to it, "Never will fruit be on you." And the tree instantly withered. The disciples saw what happened and marveled, asking, "How did the tree wither so quickly?" And what somebody who knew about figs would know about that tree is when it has leaves, it means it's got fruit, but there is no fruit on it. Nothing to be found but leaves. That is very much like Sardis. They look good, but there's nothing there. This congregation in Sardis reflected too well the society and the city they were in. Sardis' defense was so easy that they all went to sleep and they were invaded. There's no indication, by the way, that the congregation in Sardis ever suffered from the persecution that Christians in other cities suffered. There's no indication that they had problems with pagan worship or the Jews. They seem to have been at peace. Reuel Shelley wrote, "Notice particularly that Sardis was evidently experiencing no persecution. How could this be unless the church there had ceased to be evangelistic? A godly, zealous, and evangelistic church will face difficulties when it's attempting to evangelize in a hostile environment of governmental persecution. The church there must have been content simply to hold services for those already in its membership and was stirring no opposition by challenging Jews, pagans, idols, or anything else. Sardis was a peaceful church, if you like the peace of a cemetery." And Stephen Travis basically said the same thing. It was not a dwindling congregation of elderly people. It has not been brought to the verge of extinction by the ravages of persecution or heresy. It is serenely unaware that the peace which it enjoys is the peace of the cemetery. It's a perfect model of inoffensive Christianity. W.B. West Jr., by the way, said there are a few things better organized than a cemetery, but there's no life there. They were so at peace that they've gone to sleep. They've drifted into a coma. They're now almost dead. They were their own worst enemies. By the way, notice there's no real mention of good works. They're known for them from the past, but no real mention of doing good. But there was still hope. They needed to be watchful. The NIV they had to wake up and to strengthen the things which are about to die. Literally, the things they're about to throw away, which is an interesting thing. Gene West commented on that. He said, "A person may die through no effort of his own. As a matter of fact, he may die in spite of every effort to forestall death. However, throwing away is a voluntary act. Most of what we throw away knowingly and purposely. This is what the Lord warned against." And Ramsey writes, "The advice which he gives to the Sardians is, in a way, universally suited to human nature. Be watchful, be more careful, carry out more completely and thoroughly what you have still to do. For hitherto you've always erred in leaving work half done and incomplete." See, there are some things that still had a little life left in them, and they needed to resuscitate what was left before it also died. They needed to complete what they had started. They had quit too soon. They had basically taken early retirement. Why were those precise topics the ones that Jesus emphasized for the Christians in Sardis. Well, if you think about the city, no city in Roman Asia had as glorious a history in the past as did Sardis. And that's what he says about the Christians. No city had such a contrast between their history and their present condition of decay as a city. And so went the congregation. Ramsey says its history was the opposite of the record of Smyrna. Smyrna was dead and yet lived. Sardis lived and yet was dead. Despite their wonderful history, the city of Sardis in the Roman era was a city of failure, whose history was marked by the downfall of great military strength when it seemed to be at its height. It was reputed to be a fortress that couldn't be taken, yet it was taken twice in its history. The entrance to the fortress on the Acropolis was heavily guarded, yet they failed to consider the perpendicular cliffs which they thought no one could scale. As a great and ruling power, Sardis was dead, but it was still thought of, they seem to think of themselves this way, as having a reputation of strength and wealth. And that's exactly what we find in the congregation as well. Ramsey went on to say, no one can doubt that this Sardian letter took its form in part through the memory of that ancient history. It was impossible for the Sardians to miss the allusion, and therefore the writer must have intended it and calculated on it. Phrase after phrase is chosen for the evident purpose of recalling that ancient memory, which was undoubtedly still strong and living among the Sardians. The Christians well reflected the city itself with their blind confidence, which allowed them to sink into apathy, into decay, and into death. They were crumbling like the top of the Acropolis city. Leah liked that. They were stuck in a rut, too comfy, probably. That's very good. The church is relatively small, but built against within the ruins of the Artemis Temple. Yeah, there was one there later as well. So he goes on to say, remember. Remember, therefore, what you've heard and received. Hold fast and change your heart. If you do not watch, I'll come like a thief, and you will not know when I will come. They needed to remember what they'd received and heard, basically what they had been taught. And that Bible study notes tells us that this expression probably refers to the initial instruction in the Christian life they had received and been taught. This included doctrine and ethical teaching. They needed to start practicing it, keeping it, obeying it, making it a part of their lives. Obedience is not a popular idea today. To many, it sounds too restrictive. What people want is to do what they want and what they think, and they think that's freedom. But the constant theme through the New Testament scripture is the need to obey, to hold fast God's word. That's what those in Sardis needed to do. They're not charged with any false doctrine. They're charged with a lack of interest. They look alive, but they're dead. And if they didn't wake up, then Jesus would come like a thief. Just like Sardis was overthrown twice by soldiers who came in the middle of the night like thieves, that would happen to the Christians if there was no change. Jesus would come in judgment on them. Possibly he's telling them that he would remove what little they had. This would be particularly relevant to those living in a town which had been twice taken by surprise. But the good news was, it wasn't everybody that was affected. We have a but in verse 4. But you have a few names in Sardis who have not defiled their garments. They will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. So not everyone in Sardis was on the verge of dying. Vast majority, yes. Some had not soiled, had not defiled their garments. That seems to be referring to being actively involved in sin of some type. The two letters where the Christians received the most condemnation are Sardis and Thyatira. Thyatira, though, were doing quite a bit of good and were improving in what they did. Although, if you remember, they let in false teaching and some were being led astray. It wasn't that way in Sardis. Ramsey expressed it this way: Sardis was not Christian enough to entertain a heresy or be led astray by a false system. It had lost all vigor in life. It had sunk back to the ordinary pagan level of conduct, which from the Christian point of view was essentially vicious and immoral in principle. Those who hadn't soiled their garments, those who were still faithful, would walk with the Lord in white, in purity. They were worthy. Their lives reflected who they were. Then we have the ending, which is very similar to the ending of all the letters, although what they're given is always different. He who overcomes will be clothed in white garments. I will never remove his name from the book of life. And I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Let him who has an ear hear what the Spirit says to the congregations. Leslie Thomas, in his little work on the letters to the seven churches, said, although dead, the church in Sardis was not hopelessly dead. It was still possible for them to wrest themselves from the death grip. He who overcomes would be clothed in white garments. White garments are said to be the garments of victory. When they had a victory parade, they all came out in their white garments to walk in that parade. But white also indicates innocence and purity. No longer wearing soiled clothes, defiled clothing, they would have clean, white clothes to wear. And Jesus would change his verdict, and their names would not be removed from the book of life, a list of those who were citizens of God's kingdom. Ramsey explains how this applies. He says, as in all Greek and Roman cities of that time, there was kept a list of citizens according to their class or tribe or deme, in which new citizens were entered and from which degraded citizens were expunged. So the writer of this letter figuratively mentions the book of life. There is a remnant in Sardis whose name shall never be deleted from the book, from which most Sardians have been expunged already. And not only that, since they had confessed his name during their lives, Jesus would confess their name before the Father and his angels. Gene West wrote, Christ would confess ownership of those who overcame, for they were his. Stephen Travis writes, if most of the church in Sardis have kept quiet about Jesus for fear of the consequences, there remain a few who have readily confessed that they belong to him. And those who acknowledge in the presence of others that they belong to him may be sure that he will acknowledge in God's presence that they are his. Such a great thing. You acknowledge Jesus, he's going to acknowledge us. He said that himself, by the way. But this was very important. If they had ears, they'd better be listening to the message of Jesus to the congregations. And that's basically the letter. I was amazed as I went through that how much the letter reflected the whole situation of the city of Sardis. And as we've been going through these is the fifth one, each of them we've seen very much reflects the situation that they're living in. And so they're very much tailored to a particular situation, but at the same time, It's for all the congregations, because that word in the last sentence of each one of them is a plural, not just the one congregation, but to all the congregations. By the way, one of the lessons, and I always start with this one, Jesus knows all that we're going through. You notice in each letter, he starts with saying, I know what you're doing. I know what's happening. This time wasn't a whole lot, by the way, but he knew it. He knew what they were doing. Complacency can be as much of a problem as false teaching. Often complacency can lead to allowing false teaching in. And this maybe reflects a little bit of what Lee was saying. Are we willing to take a stand on what the Bible says, realizing that if we do, we may lose popularity with those around us? I think it's Stephen Travis who writes in his commentary, when a church takes a stand against prevailing attitudes and practices in society, it will lose popularity. When it insists that Christ is not just one possible Savior among many, but is Lord of the universe, it will provoke hostility. When its members actually make the Sermon on the Mount their very lifeblood, they will make people feel that the rules by which the world operates are being undermined. I thought he expressed that quite well, because when we take a stand, we will receive opposition, and we should expect it. Second, fourth lesson, I think, and this is what Andy was just saying. Are we basking in a past reputation as a congregation, or are we known for what we're doing now as a growing community of disciples? Too often, you just listen to congregations. They talk about all the things they did in the past. I want to know what they're doing now. What are they doing now? Do we live lives of obedience to Jesus? I think that's more what Paul was reflecting there as well. And Stephen Travis had this to say: we are unlikely to disobey Jesus by publicly disowning him. Yet our responses of obedience or disobedience that come to us in everyday life are in fact building us into people who are able or unable to face the ultimate test. Are we willing to live lives that are seen to be obeying Jesus? And the last one I have, if we expect Jesus to confess our names before the Father, are we confessing his name here? This is not talking about what we do when we become a Christian. This is talking about every day. Are we willing to stand up for Jesus? Just coming up to the 9 o'clock hour, 1 minute away. Time was not bad tonight. Next week, the letter to Philadelphia. It's in the middle of chapter 3 of Revelation. Also, don't forget Mark's class on Mondays. Job's questions, God's answers. And our first weekend at East Kilbride this past weekend on evidences was very good. Both Mark and I were encouraged at the reaction of those who were there, around 17 present. Second weekend is the 6th and 7th of September, and we'll deal with what Genesis and evolution say about creation and our origin. So we are looking forward to that. If you're in our area, you're more than welcome. Patrick says that there's still some spaces left at the autumn weekend family retreat. So that's coming up in about 2.5 weeks, thereabouts. Yeah, about that. So if you want to go to that down in Norfolk, you can register for that online. And also, don't forget about the study week in November, Israel following the exile. Book your place, because that's an exciting week of study.